Hey everyone, good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. This is Dan Cohen with MintPress News coming at you from Washington, D.C. Today, I am going to be discussing the latest in the Ukraine Russia crisis, war, invasion, special operation, call it whatever you like. Um, we'll be talking about that with two really good guests, as well as the big announcement we've just heard from President Biden, um, which I'm going to play a clip of in a minute. But we're going to be discussing the great decoupling, the great bifurcation, basically this splitting of kind of the U.S. led global economy from the Eastern powers, from Russia and China. The Ukraine crisis has basically been a pretext for the U.S. to try to cut Russia out, to isolate Russia, as it has done with Venezuela and Iran and other countries. But Russia is, of course, a much more integral part of the global economy. So we'll be talking about that. And then we'll also be talking about Russophobia, which I think is something that is very important, is a very animating factor in what's happening, but doesn't really get talked about a lot. So here in the U.S., gas prices are skyrocketing, which is the main thing that most average people are feeling already. Joe Biden talked about that today and basically said it's a necessary sacrifice. In California, it's gas is more than $5 per gallon. And we just learned in recent days over the weekend that the US sent a delegation to Venezuela to basically negotiate resumption of fuel purchases, of petroleum purchases from Venezuela. Um, and President Maduro last night addressed the country and said that a delegation from the U.S. had indeed come, and they're basically open to dialogue. So we didn't reveal much in terms of details, but that's going to come out in the coming days. I mean, there's a lot of significance to that. For one thing, it's, I think, the Biden administration finally coming to grips with the end of the Juan Guaido coup project. Basically, Biden took Guaido out back and put an end to him, sent him to the horse hospital, so to speak. Um, and so that's been a failure. And so it's pretty interesting to see that the U.S. trying to wean itself off of Russian petroleum is now going back to Venezuelan petroleum, which after, you know, it completely cut off Venezuelan oil imports and basically destroyed the Venezuelan economy, reduced it by 99%. In addition to attempting various kinds of coups d'etats and invasions with mercenaries, and killed tens of thousands of people in the process. We know from a Center for Economic and Policy Research report from, I think, 2019 that 40,000 people were killed as a result of lack of access to medicine. Um, so, and the U.S. has already kicked Russia out of SWIFT. The entire corporate world has pulled out of Russia, for the Western corporate world, for what it claims is a moral stance um, against war in Ukraine. Though, that includes McDonald's has now pulled out even of Russia, which, I would think if they want to poison Russians, then maybe McDonald's is a great way to do that, keeping McDonald's there. There's also the issue of gas in Europe. So all of these things we're going to get into with our guests. So I'm going to bring them in right now. First of all, we have Professor Glenn Diesen, an author of many books, including his most recent, which is on Russophobia. And welcome, Dr. Diesen. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And then I also have Anatoly Karlin, who's a journalist in Moscow and has been writing. He posts on Substack and is very active on Twitter, has a lot of very incisive commentary, and is going to kind of give us a view on what is going on in Russia. What do Russians actually think, because we're getting a very skewed perception through US media here, predictably. So I mean, first of all, it seems like we're going into unprecedented territory here with this great decoupling of the decoupling of the U.S. and Russian economies. Some call it the Great Bifurcation, and there are some obvious similarities between what's happening now and the Cold War, the old Cold War, but in terms of an East-West divide. But the players are very different. Russia is obviously, the Soviet Union is gone. Russia is a different player, and also China is a completely different player than it was a few decades ago. So I want to ask, what do you see, Professor Diesen? What do you see happening with this divide? I mean, what are the repercussions? How do you interpret it?
Well, this has been something that has bothered Washington, given that it hasn't really been sure how to deal with this emergence of a multipolar international system. So one of the problems, the relationship between the United States and the European countries, it has obviously been that the security dependence on the United States hasn't been properly converted or translated into geoeconomic loyalties. So we've seen over the past few years, the Europeans are buying Chinese high-tech products, such as the 5G system. They're buying the Russian gas. This also despite Washington's opposition. They're signing up for, well, many of the countries have signed up for the Belt and Road Initiative from China. The Turks are buying Russian weapon systems. The Indians are doing the same, defying U.S. sanctions. And also, the Europeans want to trade with the Iranians and avoid American sanctions. And overall, this has been something that the United States has been able to deal with because, simply put, if the European economies want to be competitive, then they have to, for example, buy Russian gas, because the Russian gas is cheap gas. It comes through pipelines instead of LNG. So effectively, in Europe, we had the dilemma between, staying loyal, geoeconomically loyal to the US, if you will, or have competitive economies, because now all the cheap gas is going to China instead. So we will have more expensive production and less competitive industries. This is one of the achievements in this war, if you want to call it an achievement, has been all the Europeans are now in line. They're cutting their economic ties with Russia, and a little bit like a new Iron Curtain, if you want. So now we're only supposed to align up with the United States. So I think this is something that Europeans, especially the EU, has tried to avoid for a long time. Again, for a while, the EU had this very globalist, if you want, or liberal ideas about economics. But over the past few years, the EU has formed this concept of strategic autonomy, so be less dependent on Washington and be able to trade with whomever they want. And so they linked the strategic autonomy with the concept of European sovereignty. In my opinion, all of this has to go out the window now, because if we're going to follow the Americans, the Europeans, are going to follow the American sanctions against Russia, but then also China, then obviously this means going back under the U.S. Protection, if you want, and integrating it back into a U.S.-led economic system. So it's a huge shock to Europe. I mean, obviously these sanctions are causing a lot of pain in Russia, but they will also create a lot of pain here in Europe as well.
Right. I mean, Europe is extremely dependent. I read that Europe gets 40% of its gas from Russia, and some countries get all of it. They get all of their fuel from Russia. So I mean, if to basically buy American natural gas is obviously more expensive, and the people that are going to pay the price for that are the working class, average people. So it seems like Europe is going to be in for some real suffering. I mean, basically a lot of people are going to be in for real suffering as a result of these political economic decisions.
So
And
yeah, obviously this goes now the fuel prices, but what we have next is a food crisis. So the price on food, fuel, all of these areas are now gonna are already skyrocketing. And I think this pressure on Russia, it might have worked if this was the 1990s or the 2000s, but again, Russia has seen this day coming at least since 2014. So since 2014, when the West backed this coup in Ukraine, and it became evident that Ukraine will be increasingly integrated into the US or Western orbit, if you want. Russia effectively abandoned its former goals of creating this greater Europe as a successor of Gorbachev's common European home, if you want. And this is when Russia began to move towards greater Eurasia instead, seeing instead that its economic future would have to be linked towards China and other countries in the East. And obviously, this huge economic fallout from cutting off with Russia obviously spreads very quickly to China. These reports in Western media that Chinese will not want to support Russia because economic interest. In my opinion, this is a lot of nonsense, because I think the Chinese sees this was coming their way as well. At some point, the Americans will start to cut them off of various cut off the economic ties as well, and try to throw the kitchen sink after them as well. So I think they're watching what's happening in Russia, and they're making very quick adapting as well. So cutting off American technologies, stop using their transportation corridors, stop using their transaction systems such as SWIFT, their banks, currencies. And I think across the board, this will have huge effects. Even if this crisis will be solved tomorrow, this is going to change the world as we know it.
Anatoly, what does it look like from Moscow? I mean, what is Putin saying? What are politicians saying? What are people? What is the reaction from that you're seeing from politicians and from average people and kind of different political camps to this decoupling?
According to the opinion polls, 60 to 70% support this war. So I think it's certainly premature to speculate about color revolutions and so on, as people are already eagerly doing so for understandable reasons on Twitter. Because it's not just Russian opinion polls; it's also some Western ones as well. So just to get some early objections out of the way. My opinion, which I stated at the outset, before the war, in fact, which I predicted, was that Putin's goals are probably pretty maximalist. Because and indeed the the severity of the Western sanctions, if anything, just confirms that that this is going to go that way. Because if Russia is going to be cut off from the world economy, from the Western world economy, to such an extent, then it doesn't really make sense to moderate its sort of war aims. As regards the likely impact, what we have now is even as Russia gets cut off and the central bank's reserves get, a lot of them have been frozen, about 60% of them, according to some reports, although according to other reports, it has repatriated many of those assets to Russia, so it's unclear what is going on. But yeah, these are sort of huge sanctions and Western companies pulling out. But at the same time, you have this sort of spike in resource prices, such as we see oil at $125, which is basically going to increase Russia's current account by $20 billion this year alone. And nickel, like moon, like a crypto shitcoin, just today. So you have many examples of this happening. So ironically, even as Russia gets cut off, its sort of current account massively improves. So the net effect on GDP and living standards would be significantly modulated by this. So probably this is actually in stark contrast to what happened in 2014, when you also had sanctions over Crimea and the Donbass, but they were much more modest, obviously, relative to the sanctions today. But at the same time, back in 2014, you had the end of the commodity super cycle, and they collapsed in oil prices, which frankly did more damage to the Russian economy than those modest sanctions. But now you have the other way down. You have the commodities actually buffering the Russian economy. So I don't actually think that the shock to living standards would be as extreme as many people are positing right now, and commensurately, obviously, the political effects. Because at the end of the day, if Putin achieves his main aims, so basically the military solution to the in Ukraine, and basically he would be considered as the god of the Russian lands, a historical figure along the lines of Catherine the Great or Ivan III. I do not. If the military operation ends up successful, which I suspect it will, then I certainly don't see political domestic challenges arising out of this. But if he fails, on the off chance he fails, then it will be another story, obviously.
Right. Yeah, it seems like, I don't know, I get the sense that there's maybe some feeling of sacrifice in order to deal with what is pretty widely understood and potentially existential threat. When Zelensky spoke about obtaining nuclear weapons and this kind of thing, then there's a national sacrifice, which is kind of the opposite of what we've experienced in the U.S. with the wars that we've been involved in, and basically it started wars of aggression, where correct me if I'm wrong, in Russia it's understood as a defensive war, and contrary to Western media portrayal that this war just started a week ago or 2 weeks ago, that this is a war that started in 2014.
Well, yes, obviously. I mean, part of Russia's justification is that Kiev has been bombing the Donbass since 2014, and this is also the outlook of the people who've been bombed for 8 years. If the people who are going out and for say like anti-war meetings, for instance, the patriotic response to them would be where were you protesting these past 8 years when it was Kiev which was bombing Donetsk and Lugansk. Yes, this is certainly the way many Russians view it. Obviously, not many Russians on Twitter, because I mean, the people who go on Twitter, the people who go on Reddit, the people who talk to Western journalists, they are strongly self-selected. So they know the English language. They're sort of like cosmopolitan. They primarily live in Moscow or St. Petersburg. They are very online, to use the terminology. But not very representative of popular opinion.
Right. Yeah. When a friend in Moscow described kind of who's going to be suffering as a result of basically being cut off from the West, and it's just she described it's kind of the middle and upper class who are used to vacationing in Western Europe and using iPhones and the kind of living more luxurious lives, and is that your sense of who's going to be directly bearing the brunt, or is it wider than that?
I mean, I don't think it's deniable that there will be a sort of a retreat in general living standards over the next year, for reasons I have described, and over the longer term, it will be an issue, the sort of the cutoff in technological imports from the West, although it will be in very large part compensated for by increasing trade relationships with China, which has basically acquired technological autonomy in many spheres of modern technology. But in general, yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, and I even had a Twitter thread on the various ways in which it is precisely the most the young, the pro-Western, like richer people, who are disproportionately affected by these sanctions. So, just to take a very recent example, the um, ban on Mastercard and Visa withdrawing their services, but it only applies to foreign Visa or Mastercard cards in Russia or abroad. So it's actually people, Russians who are abroad, who are traveling abroad, who would be majorly inconvenienced by this. Not Russians within Russia who, well, I mean, Mastercard and Visa actually still works for the most part within Russia. And even if they cut us off here, we have our own system called near. So obviously that's not going to happen. And I mean, another thing that's happening is individual Western companies, because of the social media pressure, they're also unilaterally pulling out of the Russian market. But who are they primarily hurting? Well, I mean, people like who get money from doing from catering to global audiences, essentially, and who tend to be sort of basically the most pro-Western electorate within Russia. So yes, I mean, obviously, it's not going to be very good for like people, for artists who do commissions, or video game companies, or, to take another amusing example, OnlyFans, which has cut off Russian accounts. So yes, I mean, those sort of workers, they will probably need to find another job, or find alternative platforms at any rate. But if you're talking about ordinary people with ordinary jobs, no, they will not be as strongly affected.
Professor Diesen, can you explain? You know, we were talking about how, since a lot of this goes back to 2014, and since 2014, Russia has been preparing for this kind of moment. Can you talk about those preparations and you know what Russia has done in order to, you know, basically knowing that this sort of confrontational moment was coming? How is Russia prepared for this?
Well, again, they kind of they saw that this would probably eventually end in a conflict such as what we see now. Well, maybe not necessarily a war, but obviously this is something that's been going on since the 1990s. NATO gradually expands towards Russian borders, and as NATO gradually expands towards the Russian borders, this is deemed to be an existential threat. Now, not only is the NATO weapon systems moving closer to Russian borders, but as we also see the countries on Russia's borders, many of whom are very divided between seeking closer alignment with Russia or closer alignment with the West, these countries would be forced to choose between us or them. So for this reason, they've been this is the way Russia, well, I think the way Moscow is seeing it, this could only end in one way, which is conflict. So in 2014, when the West backed this coup in Kiev, we saw that the initial sanctions came out. So what did they do? Well, they put some sanctions on Visa and MasterCard in Crimea. And, well, obviously, they saw that this would be a threat in the future. We saw also that the threats of cutting off Russia from SWIFT occurred from 2014. So at this time, Russia began to seek both strategic autonomy, but also diversifying its ties. So the strategic autonomy would refer to ensuring that its strategic technologies are not Western. So with all these sanctions, they began to develop their own anything from the material in production. You also see the digital products as either having this strategic autonomy or partnering up with China. Again, when you have if you have sanctions in a unipolar order, when the West has all the economic power, then you can bring countries to their knees. However, in a multipolar system, sanctions often have the purpose of simply handing over huge market share to someone else. So what we've seen since 2014, Russia and China has been developing this technological partnerships. So everything from mobile phones to automation, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, self-driving cars. Across the board, you find various areas of cooperation to ensure that Russia does not become too dependent on Western technologies and Western industries. Some of this has been strategic as well. For example, when Russia puts its counter sanctions on the West, it helps to build, for example, an agricultural industry, so making itself an agricultural superpower. Because again, this was the problem in the 1990s. Russia was just exporting energy resources, importing manufactured goods. So it began to reverse this, obviously. So using instead its revenue from energy resources to subsidize development of its own industries. And second, it's also been developing new transportation corridors, similar but to a lower scale of what China has done with the Belt and Road Initiative. But also seen in financial instruments, the SWIFT has already been replaced with a domestic system, but the Chinese also released SIPS, which is the Chinese SWIFT, if you want, in preparation that one or both of these countries would be put next on the economic hit list of the United States. They've been working on using more local currencies in their trade. Again, I remember 2 years ago, they began to Russia made this argument that it had to start dropping all dollars from its reserves. Again, they argued that this was a strategic decision, that they couldn't continue to follow the dollar system, given that they saw it to be unreliable. And again, this is not just of course, conflicts are because we're heading into conflict. They predicted this, but also it goes within just more of a economic theory. That is, when you have all economic power concentrated in one country, such as the United States, then the United States will have a lot of interest to use these economic instruments in a responsible manner, so to ensure trust, so the world would integrate under a US-led system. But as you see the relative economic power of the US continuing to decline, it becomes the US has more and more incentives to use its economic instruments as a punishment to coerce rival states, and will try to prevent new centers of power from emerging. But in doing so, at the same time, they create all the more incentives for countries like Russia, China, and others to begin to diversify away from the United States. So I think you've seen it in all the sectors, from technologies, strategic industries, transportation corridors, financial instruments, and currencies. And obviously, the first thing they did in 2014, once the government in Ukraine was toppled, was immediately sign huge gas deals with the Chinese and start to build these huge pipelines towards China, which are operational now, of course. And the idea would be not to be so dependent on energy exports to Europe. And this is what we see now, and it's it will only intensify. And this is great news for China. Of course, it gets more cheap Russian gas, and the Europeans will not have it. But I think this is, I think from a Russian perspective, it has, obviously has a disadvantage. All these sanctions are creating a lot of problems for Russia, but also it was hoping to have a more diversified its partners to a greater extent. So have the Europeans, have the Indians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the South Koreans, so have all these partners. So now, because of this economic divorce from the West due to all of these sanctions, I think Russia will be now more integrated into a Chinese-led economic system than it would otherwise have preferred to do. So it's really, a massive decoupling. But again, they have prepared for this for 8 years. So my guess is that they will be able to pull through. And as Anatoly pointed out, this is the idea that the sanctions would make Russians turn on their own government. I think it misunderstands what the motivations would be, how they see Russia's motivation. Because I think in the West we kind of sold this idea that Russia's or Putin's out shopping for new territory. He just wants to conquer some more new territory. It's very opportunistic. He wants to restore a Soviet Union. And if this would be the case, then obviously all the sanctions put on Russia, the Russians would rise up and say, listen, this is not worth it, your grand ambitions. But this is not how it's seen. I don't think there's many people in Russia who doubts that the NATO expansion and mobilization along the Russian border is an existential threat. So if you see an existential threat to your country, you're willing to absorb some more punishment. You tighten the belt, you accept that this is some hard times going forward. But again, I think now Russia's in this spot where, well, what else can it do now? If it would just give up in Ukraine, go back tomorrow, pull all its troops out, what would happen? Well, NATO would follow the Russians straight into Ukraine, and it would be an unacceptable situation for Russia, one they couldn't live with. So I think this will cause a lot of pain for Russia, but I think I think most of the population will see it as necessary to absorb it, given that there's no solution, there's no compromise coming from the Europeans or the Americans.
Right. By the way, I want to just say to everyone watching that we see. I think everyone can see the comments, and we can definitely ask any questions you want. There's a super chat function, and we'll be sure to answer any questions you want to throw out there. Another question I have is how much. There's a lot of talk about the de-dollarization of the global economy and basically the dollar being, basically out losing its reserve currency status. Is this something that is happening? I mean, is this accelerated by these sanctions, or how do you see this, Professor Diesen?
Well, I would say definitely. Well, the US dollar has gradually decreased as a trading currency, but also a reserve currency in many countries now. And I think the cutoff from SWIFT is especially important because, over the past years, we see that I guess Russia and China has led this de-dollarization process. They've been stacking up on gold. They've been working towards using more and more local currencies in their trade, but they're also encouraging this with other partners, especially in the Eurasian space. So this de-dollarization has obviously been a huge focus, especially since 2014. And this is part of the effort of decoupling from American financial institutions and instruments. So again, cutting off from American development banks, the payment systems, and of course the US dollar. But the SWIFT, this is really a dramatic escalation because this will force Russia to sever itself from the dollar system. And this is the biggest energy exporter. So I think, and obviously, as I see it, China will have to follow as well because I think they see themselves as being next in line. At some point, the US will seek to cut China off SWIFT as well, especially if the conflict continues to intensify around Taiwan. So I think this is going to be a huge intensification of de-dollarizing as soon as possible. And again, I have to admit I was a bit surprised as well that the West took this huge step of cutting Russia off SWIFT, partially off SWIFT. I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, they didn't properly consult with the Federal Reserve or anyways, this has just been this is gonna, I think, be a disaster, an absolute disaster for the US dollar.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more, Anatoly. We were discussing, the kind of mood inside Russia. I want to show some of the headlines that we're seeing in Western media. I mean, it's really, we're getting so much cartoonish propaganda in the U.S. about what Putin's motives are. Here's, for example, I think everyone can see. Oh, sorry, let me bring it back here. There we go. We have the Daily Beast. Putin isn't just insane; it's far worse than that. Glimpses into, he has a messiah complex. Glimpses into Putin's inner sanctum offer horrifying clues about the state of the mind of the man with his finger on the nuclear button. So there's a real there's an effort to portray Putin as insane. There's, let's see, what else do we have?
Well, I mean, all I will say is that people have been psychoanalyzing Putin for 2 decades now. And also, there's been literally for decades as well various rumors about his health, like sarcoma of the spine. That was the story a few years ago, or some cancer that's making him do increasingly risky moves. Or now the new narrative is the mental effects from COVID isolation. I don't think that's a very productive discussion, obviously.
Long COVID. This is all a result of long COVID. Yeah, I mean, here's let me change the tab. Then we have Putin's imperial delirium. I've seen him compared to Russian czars. I've seen him compared to Stalin. So, you would think those contradict themselves a little bit, but in Western propaganda, I guess that none of that really matters. You can just say whatever you want. What else do we have? I think, those are the ones we pulled up. But so I mean, I kind of want to use that to talk about go back to what we were discussing before about what people see, what people are thinking inside Russia. I mean, for one thing, we hear nonstop in Western media about so-called anti-war protests, which you addressed a little bit. And as you said, what Russian patriots, people who support the war, military operation, tend to say is, where were you the last 8 years? Which I think is a really fair point. That the Donbass was getting, obliterated. But who are the people who are going to these, so-called anti-war protests? What is the kind of class dynamic? Who, is it liberals who are, very kind of pro-Western, or who are the people who are going to these things?
Well, I mean, it's younger people. Obviously, it's people in big cities. It's people with who tend to be more on the internet than listen to TV, and it's yes, primarily liberals who would have in previous sort of protest cycles have gone to Navalny demonstrations or protested against electoral fraud a decade ago. So it's basically the same sort of crowd who. This is obviously the latest obvious cause to support. I mean, obviously not exclusively liberals. Obviously, some people from other political clusters, but those are obviously the core of the protesters.
Right. I want to pull up this poll that you had tweeted out. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. All right, 1 second. Let me get this pulled up. All right, here we go. So, yeah, the poll you had tweeted is 68%. Can everyone see that? Yeah, of Russians approve, 22% oppose the special military operation. As I said, there's no meaningful distinction between Putin and the Russian people on this question. So, I mean, assuming that polling data is legitimate, and I mean, I think that kind of says a lot. I mean, of course, at the in the beginning of every war that I've experienced here in the U.S., there tends to be really strong support at first, and then inevitably when it turns into a lengthy occupation, then polling goes down. I mean, George Bush's numbers were great at the beginning of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and then of course went down and became abysmal. But I think we're dealing with a different dynamic in terms of what Russia is doing. I mean, the U.S. lied about Saddam Hussein obtaining weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons in order, as a pretext for invading Iraq, and that was actually discussed by Zelensky, and Ukraine is directly on Russia's border. So basically, what the U.S. said about Iraq is actually very true about Ukraine. I guess yeah, if there's anything either of you want to add to that about kind of internal Russian.
I think that particular polling question was carried out by VTOM, which is a state-backed, state-owned pollster. So one might reasonably have some concerns over its impartiality. But those numbers were basically confirmed by another poll, which is linked to the pro-Western opposition, which had basically the same numbers, if you adjust for wording differences. So I think that figure is perfectly plausible, and moreover, it's even if you make that comparison, well, when Bush was going in, the support for the Iraq war was around 70% exactly, so much like it is in Russia now. And now, will it remain at that level? Well, yeah, I mean, obviously that depends on how the occupation goes, but from what my guess is that there will not be an Iraq-style insurgency. I mean, I wrote about this in my article, "The Gathering the Russian Lands," which I wrote before the war. But the basic reasons boil down to Ukraine having a much lower fertility rate than Afghanistan or Iraq. There's many fewer young men to carry out an insurgency. Historically, central Ukraine and eastern, not even speaking of eastern and southern Ukraine, they've been within the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union for hundreds of years with no insurgency. The only insurgency that historically occurred was in the far west in Galicia after World War II. So not much historical cause to expect an insurgency, and also technological change. So basically, the proliferation of telecommunications, mobile cellular telecommunications, means that you can, in principle, feed it through. You can gather this data, cellular data, and in fact, an organization in Moscow does exactly that. It's called SORM. And you can use AI to analyze those conversations and identify resistant cells, terrorist cells. So I think that in general, insurgency in a modern state has become much more difficult over the past 20 years relative to what it was a decade ago, or let alone 2 decades ago. And even so far as we can see, I mean, Russian troops have already occupied some Ukrainian regions, so all of Kherson pretty much at this point. For instance, so something like 6 million Ukrainians are now under sort of military occupation, and there's no significant insurgency in those areas. So at least so far, that sort of theory seems to be being borne out.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't think there will be a successful insurgency. I guess that's one of the questions that I've had. I mean, and you've already answered it, but I mean, maybe I can pull up some of these articles. But the U.S. has, of course, predictably been training insurgents in Ukraine. Here's this LA Times article that came out recently about 2 weeks ago. I mean, this is an op-ed saying why the U.S. should not do that. But, this is based on a Yahoo News article investigation that revealed that the CIA has been training Ukrainian, basically insurgents, a stay-behind group to wage war. So I don't know. You think it's? What do you think?
I don't think it's realistic for the reasons I've described. It's hard to do it in a modern state with a mass cell phone usage, which can be filtered, and in a country with a very small amount of men in the sort of like the military age. Well, because of the post-Soviet demographic collapse, which also affects Russia. And the other main very big difference, obviously, with Iraq or Afghanistan is the banal fact that Ukrainians who are deeply dissatisfied with living either in Russia or in a more pro-Russian Ukraine, which is what we will get after the war. They always have the freedom to emigrate unimpeded into Poland, say, or Czechia or Hungary. So given the choice between facing near certain death or imprisonment for like waging an insurgency that frankly has zero chance of success, or just emigrating, I mean, the choice in this scenario seems pretty obvious to me.
How about you, Professor Diesen? What's your thoughts on an insurgency?
Well, I think it would all depends on how far Russia would go. Again, in Donbass, I think obviously, well, the further east you are in the country, the more Russian-friendly population you will find. But the further west you go, the more hostile population one would meet, with the main crossover being the Dnieper River, of course. And if you go all the way to the east in the Galicia area, obviously there, I would expect an insurgency. But I think occupying those regions would make any purpose. I mean, if you think that Russia is trying to restore the Soviet Union within the former territories, yes, in that scenario, it would make sense. But of course, I think this is fantasy. This is not what Russia's after. I think what they will probably do is seek to control this area. Well, take over these areas where there's enough Russian-friendly people that they can possibly work with, and put in place something of something of autonomous rule, which is favorable to Russia. So again, I think it all goes back to the motivation for what Russia is doing, because their main concern has always been that even if Ukraine isn't drawn into NATO overnight, their main concern has been this incrementally making Ukraine into a de facto NATO member state. And I guess they gave up on the ability of democracy to work, because again, when Zelensky won the election in 2019, he won with 73%, running on this platform of talking to Donbass and making peace with Russia. But then after he won, of course, Washington and the nationalists put the pressure on him. He refused to talk to Donbass. He didn't want to make any more peace with Russia. He called Donbass terrorists and just continued shelling the people there. So I think for that reason, and also by refusing Kyiv and the West refusing to implement the Minsk agreement for 7 years, I think they simply want to impose this now by military force. So, but by this logic, there's no purpose to go much further west of the Dnieper River. So only take the southern and the eastern regions. And again, if they can't get any diplomacy through Kyiv, some agreement, I would expect them to simply try to hand over the power to local authorities, which are distanced from Kyiv, which are more Russian friendly. So by definition, being in hostile territory is not necessarily something that they would like to do. So I have to agree that I don't see much of a insurgency, possibility for insurgency. all depending, of course, how far Russia is taking this. I'm assuming that Russia will seek to establish control over the territories between Odessa and Kharkov, and if that's how it has limited itself, then I wouldn't expect insurgency to be a major problem either.
Right, and I mean, even in that LA Times op-ed, I think a lot of people instantly think of Afghanistan when they think of, Russia and insurgency and, the experience there, which obviously bled the Soviet Union for quite a few years until it was forced to withdraw. But, it's a different, it seems like a different animal to me. And the previous insurgency that the CIA operated in Ukraine, in the late 40s and early 50s was not very successful and only lasted really a few years. So it's quite a different animal. I want to talk about, I think it's really actually important to talk about Russophobia right now. And I know it's not exactly a popular concept, and it's not a popular thing to discuss, but I think, that's because of Russophobia. Honestly, I mean, I see so much of it in media, in politics, the way Western politicians speak, the way Biden speaks. And I kind of, let me first of all show, Professor Diesen, you've just published this book, Russophobia, Propaganda and International Politics. So congratulations on finishing this work. I'm really looking forward to checking it out. Here it is on Amazon, which I suppose is not available in the eastern part of the world now. But so if most of my viewers, I suppose, are in the West. So I don't know. Maybe there's somewhere better to get it on than Amazon, than enriching Jeff Bezos. But here is his book, and then I want to show a couple of examples that I thought, that are actually from Ukraine that were pretty remarkable to me. Let me switch the tab here. So let me see if I can pull it up. Here we go. Okay, so this is something a friend sent me. This is from 2014, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys. This is put up by Igor Kolomoisky, who is a big backer of Zelensky and has funded the Azov Battalion, basically the most powerful neo-Nazi militia that's been integrated into the Ukrainian National Guard since 2014, and is, basically one of the hardest fighting forces in Ukraine right now. And this is so Kolomoisky also owns okay, sorry. So this is, yes, he's owner, Kolomoisky being the owner of the biggest bank in Ukraine, Privata Bank, and this says $10,000 for a Russian, obviously meaning killed. So this is in Ukraine. This is, I think, well known. This is one example of, I mean, this isn't just, an offhand comment or something like that. This is all over the place in Ukraine from powerful oligarchs. So here's one example that I came across. Let me see if I can find this other one. Bear with me. Here we go. And then we have this one. This was published by Ukrainian Independent Information Agency of News, which is also owned by Kolomoisky, who's a part of the 1+1 media group, which, I guess used to be kind of an AP style media outlet. It is showing, right? Yes. And so this one says, oh, why don't I have what it says? I don't know. Is that visible to you guys? Can you read that? Can you guys see that? Or maybe I make it bigger. Maybe it's too small.
Yeah, it's small.
It's too small. Okay, I think it's basically. Oh, you know what it is? It's offering like $10,000 for a dead anti-fascist is the term they use. So, and this was published in a major media outlet. So, just kind of a couple of small examples of the extreme Russophobia that has been seen all over Ukraine. I mean, there's probably 1,000 examples that we can give, but can you talk about Russophobia as kind of an animating political force, and what is your thesis on it?
Well, I define Russophobia as, well, other phobias, which is an irrational fear. Now I make it clear that there's, of course, rational fears. There's rational reasons to fear Russia. It's a powerful country, but Russophobia refers then to irrational fear, and this is the product of propaganda, because propaganda, as I define it, is the use, trying to convince the public or convince your audience without appealing to reason. And so Russophobia is therefore a product of propaganda. Now, what we often do in propaganda is not necessarily lying or misinforming. What we often see is simply the framing. That is, the world is very complex, and if you can filter the information on the complexity of the world through a favorable filter, then you can have the facts don't really matter anymore. And for example, we already see it. Historically, how we see in Russia and the West has been to a large extent racial. So because of the Mongolian occupation for 250 years, in the first few centuries, the relationship between the Western countries and Russia was seen as being Europeans against Asians, or West against East, civilization against barbarians. And then this continued all the way after the Second World War. But then during the Cold War, in this ideological framework, we divided it more according to ideologies. So you had communism versus capitalism. You had liberalism versus authoritarianism, or atheism versus Christianity. But after the Cold War, we have the main propaganda has been to revive this ideological divide. So everything has to be seen through the lens of being democracy versus authoritarian. And the way the propaganda works is once people are internalize this divide and learn to interpret the world in this way, as I said, facts don't really matter. For example, if the West interferes into Russia's domestic affairs, it's to help democracy. So it's legitimate and it's good. If Russia interferes into Western internal affairs, then it's an attack on democracy and, pretty much a declaration of war. So again, if Russia would invade a country, it's to establish empire. If the West invade, it's to spread the democracy and human rights. So this kind of translates into two narratives. You have two separate languages, and this is usually how we see propaganda works. And often Russia has, the reason I wanted to write about Russia as well is because it's very central in Western propaganda, because when we assign identities to the outgroup, who is the other, it tends to be what we consider to be our opposite. And again, you can only define yourself as white if there's black. You can only define yourself as West if there's an Eastern, or European if there's an Asian. And Russia has kind of been this, how we labeled it to be effectively an Asian power in Europe. So this has been the natural country that or people that we have othered through the years. So this barbaric Asian power. And interestingly, in this crisis, you see a lot of the same rhetoric appearing. I saw in, was it Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, were arguing that Russia is turning back to Asia. And you have, these pictures of Putin dressed, in Mongolian outfits, some cartoon to show that, they're returning to their barbaric side. So, because they're half European, half Asian, and now they're returning to this barbarism. So it's quite fascinating to see how the discourse on Russia often appeals only to this irrational. I mean, just look at this Ukraine crisis. To be honest, it pains me to see Ukrainians and Russians fighting each other. I find this to be absolutely horrible. But look at the reaction to this war compared to anything else. In the 1990s, the sanctions on Iraq killed 500,000 kids. Invasion after 2003 killed more than 1 million people. You had hundreds of thousands dying from the invasion of Libya. Currently, the US and UK are supporting a genocide in Yemen, killing more than 350 or 370,000 people. Nothing. It doesn't even pop up in the media. I'm just saying that the reason is because it is how everything is framed. This is, if the West does something wrong, it will be, at worst, it's, we do the wrong thing, but we do it for the right reasons. If the Russians, at best, they can do the right thing, but they do it for the wrong reasons. And this is effectively how propaganda works. So I argue it has a huge impact on our discourse and how it affects relations between the West and Russia.
Oh, oops, I accidentally turned them off. There we go. Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things I'm seeing from Biden, really from U.S. officials across the board is, what we hear is all about Russian oligarchs right now. And so, we're confiscating the yachts of Russian oligarchs. One of the, Biden even said today, one of the yachts that they confiscated was almost 400 feet long. It's 400 feet long, so we're supposed to celebrate that, punishing these oligarchs. A few years ago, I came across, I just, for some reason, looked up the dictionary definition of oligarch, and you can see it here. I tweeted this back in 2018. Oligarch, according to Google, is especially in Russia. So, has like a negative connotation that we use only. It's only for Russians. They are oligarchs, because apparently billionaires in the U.S. and in the West don't have political influence, or they're doing it to help average people, to help the working class. So, this is the same kind of rhetoric, and I notice this is from Google, Silicon Valley. So, we have basically powerful elements. We have our politicians, as well as kind of an extremely powerful sector of the political economy that is pushing this narrative of Russians as uniquely bad, and not that Russian oligarchs aren't bad in their own right, but the idea that the American oligarchy is going to protect us from Russian oligarchs is pretty absurd, in my opinion. I don't know, Anatoly, what do you what's your sense? I mean, watching U.S. media and you lived in, I think you said you lived in the U.S. for a decade and you lived in the U.K. for a decade, so I'm sure you've had plenty of experience with Russophobia. What is your sense of kind of what we're seeing lately?
Well, just to tack onto your point about oligarchs, I completely agree, and it's a point I've made repeatedly across my blogging as well. I mean, it's even though Reddit starkly disagrees with this, Russia is not an oligarchy in any meaningful sense of the word. It was to a large extent an oligarchy during the 1990s, when there was literally like a cabal of bankers who had inordinate influence over the government, literally called Semibankirщина. That period of history sort of ended when Putin told the oligarchs that they would no longer interfere with politics, that they wanted to keep their wealth. And the person who insisted on acting otherwise, Khodorkovsky, was made a very prominent example of. If you remember him, so he didn't end up too well. So all those oligarchs who were having their yachts taken away and so on, I mean, they don't have any significant influence over Russian politics. I mean, to the extent that the people who do have influence over Russian politics are Putin himself and a narrow group of men around him who work in the security services, so the Security Council, the Presidential Administration, and that's basically it. I mean, they're obviously very rich themselves, and much richer than like orders of magnitude richer than the official salaries would make possible. But they are not oligarchs in any meaningful sense of the word, as in it's not their wealth that translates into political power. So yes, I mean, I agree with that point. As regards Russophobia, well, yes, I mean, I agree as well. It's always existed, and for I think frankly understandable reasons. It's sort of reached a fever pitch over the past 2 weeks. I mean, it is sort of a pretty stark challenge to the international order. I mean, I'm not surprised by this, and to a large extent understand it. What I do actually find most ironic about it, however, is that it primarily affects Russians who are likeliest to be anti-war. Basically, and some of them are pretty ridiculous as well. So like the ban on cats, for instance, there was like that cat show, which Russians were banned from, and chess tournaments. I mean, like people who would probably be significantly more anti-war due to their exposure to the West are the ones who are actually being punished for it. And in Britain, for instance, there was a restriction on Russian citizens from owning more than 50,000. From having accounts of more than 50,000 British pounds in British banks. So again, what kind of Russians are going to have that kind of money in British banks? Well, I mean, the London is probably the Russian community in London is probably the single most anti-Russian constituency in the world. Quite frankly, if you look at historical election results, I mean, this is like one of the very few constituencies amongst whom the Western liberals actually beat Putin in elections, and by a large margin. I mean, that's just one example, and like the visa bans, which have been issued by the EU. Again, who's going to be traveling to the EU? Well, I mean, it's going to be on average people who are sort of more pro-Western on average, and they're being banned from that. So I think that the really distinguishing and ironic feature about this wave of Russophobia isn't so much that it exists. I mean, its existence is understandable given the context, but that it's so ineffectively targeted, essentially.
Right. I mean, here's I'm sure everyone can see I have this NBC article: International Cat Federation bans Russian felines from competition. So, I mean, which is just, I mean, it's funny, but it's pretty sad. You know, they said they cannot just witness these atrocities and do nothing. I mean, for one thing, the hypocrisy is just stunning to me. The idea that as many wars as the U.S. is currently involved in, has been involved in, that, you know, Professor Diesen laid out, from Iraq to Afghanistan, Yemen, you know, Palestine, you know, Yugoslavia. I mean, there are so many, and then this is the moral stand that you know the establishment takes is absurd, and but you know, kicking Russian cats out. So it's this kind of, you know, anything Russian is responsible. There's also, you know, this, what we're seeing on Twitter, for example, that anybody who works for RT or formerly worked for RT, for example, Rachel Blevins, who's my former colleague at RT America, is she, since RT America shut down last week, Rachel no longer works for RT, but is still stuck with this state affiliated media tag on her Twitter, in order to kind of, you know, make her stick out, delegitimize her. And no one who has, you know, who works for Voice of America or, you know, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, basically, which are CIA propaganda outlets that don't give you a shred of the, you know, freedom to report as you like, as RT frankly does. My experience in RT, I was very, very free. I wasn't ever told to take any specific political line, and there are numerous instances where I saw, you could see all kinds of programming condemning Russia or this, that, or the other thing. There's all kinds of contradictions in RT, but nonetheless, you see this label is permanently affixed to her Twitter, and so many others. And I've even seen one guy who has nothing to do with RT or Sputnik or any Russian state media, and got the Russian state media label. And he was actually criticizing. He was heavily criticizing the Russision operation in Ukraine. So he's generally anti-war, but was criticizing it and still got labeled with this. So to me, it seems like it's also there's kind of a political utility, that certainly there's Russophobia or all kinds of phobias or racism that it exists just in its own right, and it kind of creates a life of its own. But there's a political utility for it. There's a reason that Google goes out of its way to label oligarchs as a specifically Russian phenomenon, and there's a very specific reason that Twitter, especially now, goes out of its way to put these labels on Russian, affiliated media accounts in order to kind of, ostracize them and from from everyone else, to make them appear different and have like a scarlet letter. So I think it's important to acknowledge, to be very aware of the political utility of that. I don't know if either of you guys want to say anything on that.
Well, I guess just how dangerous it is, because this way, this heavy propaganda against Russia and Russophobia, which aims to present everything as a struggle between good and evil. Again, the purpose is to only reach one conclusion. I mean, it can feel very good, for the self-righteous, but I go back to Walter Lippmann. Like in this book, I go back to Walter Lippmann in the 1920s, because he recognized something, the benefits and the disadvantages of propagandizing and creating these kind of phobias. And he argued that the benefit, obviously, is you mobilize public opinion. And he noticed that from the British involvement in the Russian Civil War, and also in the First World War, the heavy propaganda and demonization of Germans in the First World War to mobilize the American public to agree to get America into war. And he says, so it's great for mobilizing public opinion by presenting the world as being, fight of good versus evil. But he argued that the main problem became you can't have a workable peace thereafter, because you can't negotiate with evil. So, for example, with Germany after World War I, there was no compromise that could be done. It had to lead to ultimate defeat. And once they were defeated, it had to be humiliating victory, which was So this is the problem, because if you accept that Russia has strategic interests, it has legitimate security interests. It has reasons to be fearful of NATO expanding on its borders. Now we can then we can find a compromise. We can find a workable peace, one which all sides have some security. However, if this is a struggle between good and evil, the only thing you can do then is peace has to be born through a victory, as good defeats evil, and all compromise become demonized as appeasement. This is something we hear over and over again in the media. Well, we're going to allow Russia this victory of not having our weapon system on its borders. Everything is an appeasement. So you can't have compromise anymore. And I think this is why we're such a dangerous position, because Russia sees itself, it has nowhere to pull back. I mean, this is like the last stand. It can't accept further NATO expansion. And meanwhile, in the West, we're obsessed with this idea that we can only have peace if we defeat Russia. And again, this is what we're talking about. Read in the media. Well, how do we envision peace from this? Well, either it can be a coup in Moscow. Someone can, kill Putin or overthrow him. Or we can pump enough weapons in and kill enough Russian soldiers on the battlefield and get a victory on the battlefield. But at no point do we ever discuss what the actual compromise could be. How could we have diplomacy in which both sides has some security? Again, this is not a discussion to have when you think that that you're in a struggle between good and evil. This is what's so dangerous with propaganda. This is what's so dangerous with this Russophobia, which paints the mindset in the West now. So I'm just that's sorry, that's my last thought on that. So
no, that's important. I mean, I think it's the other thing that strikes me is what we had through the Trump era, Russiagate. It's a perfect example where basically the only way that Trump could actually prove that he wasn't Putin's puppet or somehow indebted to the Russians was to be more aggressive, and no matter what he did, it was never enough. So really the only way is to actually go to war, like have a nuclear war with Russia in order to prove that he's not their tool. And so a lot of that entire dynamic was based around the idea of Russians being this kind of conniving group that's able to secretly control politicians on the other side of the world and this sort of thing. And so there's some very frankly racist assumptions that go along with that, and that animate to see how that was embraced by liberals who will then the next day go to a Black Lives Matter rally and declare themselves anti-racist and put a sign in front of their house here in Washington, D.C., where I live, saying, refugees are welcome and, all of these nice liberal things. But at the same time, just say these horribly racist things. But because, Russians are, basically people see Russians as white and they don't really understand how racism works, then it's considered like an acceptable form of racism.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, there's an interesting comparison because there's a Holocaust survivor, Klemperer, who wrote a book on the Nazi discourse about the Jews, and he pointed out that there was an interesting dual demonization in which Jews were portrayed on one hand as being inferior and just despised for their inferiority, and at the other hand, they were also considered to be a threat to civilization. So this inferiority was both weakness to be despised, but also this panic-stricken fear of how they could bring down civilization. And I think what better explains how we look at the Russians, how they're portrayed in the media. I mean, they're this gas station portraying, masquerading as a country. They're just this massive disdain, just viewing it as something inferior. It's quite gross. And at the same time, you have this idea that Russia's all powerful, ready to invade all of the West. Every referendum, every election that doesn't go our way, you will see the hidden Russian hand behind, preparing to bring democracy and Western civilization to an end. It is quite obscene. This paradox that they're, on one hand, so backward and inferior that they don't deserve any respect, and on the other hand, they can, bring down civilization. It has a very interesting comparison, the discourse we have about Russians and the discourse that they actually had about Jews as well. So there's obviously a pattern, and it's not a pretty one.
Right, exactly. I do want to pose one question.
Can I just
go ahead.
Just a thought about social media.
Sure.
So there were some utopian visions about the open internet a decade ago. So Twitter was actually very free flowing if you were on it back then. But indeed, over the past 5 to 7 years, I mean, really 2015, 2016, the US elections back then went up. One was the critical turning point. It started acting more and more as a sort of open tool of US influence. And you can sort of disagree whether it's good or not. I mean, obviously, this demographic which listens to the show thinks it's not good, for instance. But ultimately, every country, I think, will eventually and has exerted control over its social networks. and we will see a bifurcation of social networks, like what's happening to the world economy. It's also going to happen to the internet. You'll have sort of increasingly nationally and culturally segregated multiple internets, essentially, with Facebook, Twitter, and so on, remaining dominant in the West. With Russia has its own self-sustaining IT ecosystem. Yandex is Google, VK for Facebook, for instance. And China has its equivalents. And what you'll basically have is all of them will obviously be like promoting the party line, or whatever it happens to be within those zones, and suppressing things that go against it. And I think that that's a largely inevitable development. So frankly, it will either be that, or perhaps there will be some sort of decentralized versions of social media, which will come about as a result of the crypto revolution, such as Orbit or Lens, which sort of like return us to the utopian dream that we had a decade ago of an open internet. But it's something that centralized top-down, like social networks such as Facebook, Twitter, and so on, and their like equivalents in China or Russia or whatever, are clearly incapable of in principle.
Right. So basically, it's this kind of new Iron Curtain sort of Cold War concept playing out into the 21st century, and social media and the internet, which, as you described, was promoted, at least, I don't know how it was promoted in Russia, but here is, I imagine it's the same, but here, yeah, promoted as this, totally free platform that's going to inform everyone. And as it turned out, which, it was very open at first, and it's increasingly become obvious that it's a tool for social control. And, the US insists on promoting internet access. And, for example, in China, in Cuba, for example, there's a, huge effort of the US to push internet access in Cuba, because it's a great way for it to organize color revolutions and this sort of thing. So one question we got in the comments, I don't know if this is, I guess this is getting into speculation, but it says, what potential actions might Russia take after its special operation to roll back NATO missiles to pre-1997 levels locations? Either of you guys want to tackle that?
So to what extent is possible, or
what potential? Yeah. So the question is, what potential actions might Russia take to roll back NATO missiles to pre-1997 levels locations?
I don't think it's much that can be done to push this back, because it's already NATO territory, unless they want to go to war with NATO. I think it's more the demands that are put out from Russia. If you want security in the West, you can't deny it to Russia. So a lot of the security guarantees that Russia put forward in these negotiations before, which NATO rejected and America rejected before Russia began this conflict, was a lot of it was based on existing agreements. Again, this idea that one side shouldn't expand at the expense of another. This was, it was repeated through all since 1990s, throughout from 1990 and throughout the decade, in all these pan-European security agreements. And the reason the one from 1997 is because this was a deal they made, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was NATO committed itself to not not place any weapon systems or permanent combat troops in new member states. However, now NATO says during these negotiations, NATO refused to discriminate between new and old members, so they effectively abandoned all of the deals with Russia. So I think what Russia wanted was effectively to put together all these commitments which the West made before. So not expand NATO, not expand security at the expense of them, not put new weapon systems in new member states, not place nuclear weapons in non-nuclear weapon states, such as the US does across Europe, and put it in one package and get some firm security commitments that the West would follow it. But if the West decides not to follow it, I don't think there's much Russia can do in terms of having it removed. I think they can put pressure in terms of placing its own weapon systems. Again, if Russia begins to station nuclear weapons in Belarus or outside its own country, maybe then the US will be willing to discuss the non-proliferation treaty again. So I think it's, especially now that we have this conflict, I don't think there's much Russia can do at this moment to have the weapons removed.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
that seems pretty obvious that the Ukraine thing is Russia's literal reaction to this. There are other reasons, but this is one of the main ones as per the consensus. So what you'll basically have now is probably some kind of counter-military buildup. So Germany has announced that it's increasing military spending to 2% of GDP and allocating $100 billion to modernizing its military. So I think, that plane has passed essentially.
Right. I mean, there is, I guess one of the things that I wonder is the influence, that Ukraine is not the only Eastern European country and NATO and EU member that has a Nazi problem, that has kind of powerful Nazi contingents. It's, basically these Nazi groups have been, and Nazi collaborators, I guess is more accurate, but have been kind of bred in the Baltics, in Lithuania and Latvia, and they're powerful in Poland too. And so I wonder, at what point, what is the future of those? If there's any the possibility of confrontation with those. I mean, those seem to be kind of assets of the EU, of the West, that are obviously very anti-Russia, same as they are in Ukraine, and could be potential fronts in the future. I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on these countries and their situations?
No, well, I think it's mainly in Ukraine where it became a problem, because again, the way I see it, the neo-Nazi groups, they are a minority. However, they're a strong fighting force. So whenever there's conflict, you see them quickly rise up. So, for example, in the coup in 2014 on the Maidan, this is something that a lot of these far-right and Nazi groups, have very much boasted about in interviews, that this would not have been able to be done without them. And again, you see the pictures from Maidan as well, where those doing the heavy fighting against the government were decorated in fascist symbols. So I think that was when they first rose really into a strong position, considering that they are a smaller group, still thousands of men. And the second was with when after the coup, when Donbass decided not to recognize the legitimacy of the new government in Kyiv, we saw that there wasn't really much willingness among the regular army to go fight and kill their own countrymen in Donbass. So this was also a time when the Ukrainian government became even more dependent on using this right-wing, many of them, such as Azov Battalion, being neo-Nazi groups. And that effectively allowed them to rise up in the ranks, be integrated into the Ukrainian military. And I think this is the main problem. I guess you don't see this problem to this huge extent in other countries. Now, obviously, I'm aware of in Latvia where they have these annual SS marches through the capital, supported by the government, but still, it wouldn't be comparable to what's happening in Ukraine, I think.
Okay. anything else you guys want to say? Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up there. We've been going for 90 minutes, and I know it's late in your half of the world, far away from where I am.
Okay, yeah, just want to say that it's been a pleasure to appear on your show. Thank you for the invitation, and to people who were interested in what I have to say. Yes, I mean I'm on Twitter, I'm on Substack, karlin.substack.com. So follow if you want to read my any commentary on the Ukraine crisis and other things.
Yeah, everyone can follow Anatoly at akarlin0 on Twitter. And then you're on Substack also at Powerful Take. So akarlin.substack.com. I think I have it up on the screen. Yeah. So everybody can check out his work there. And then, so thanks a lot, Anatoly and Professor Glenn Diesen, who has just published a book on Russophobia, and has a number of excellent books on Eurasia and Russian politics. So thanks very much, you two, for coming on the live stream, and look forward to next time.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thanks. Goodbye.